don't twist, they try to whip. They not only go this way, but they will kind of try to turn into a pretzel when they turn, if they're too long, because of the horsepower being created. So this is the shaft that connects the low pressure turbine to the low pressure compressor, and that shaft, this green shaft here, is going to be pretty long. So they may end up even putting a bearing in here between, somewhere in the middle, to help support it. So there'll be a bearing here, bearing here, bearing here, bearing here, 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 and back here to support all this. You could have 6 or 8 bearings in this engine. They're going to be ball or roller type bearings. Ball or roller type bearings. Now, the heavier the part is, there's going to be a tendency to be roller bearings. Right? The roller bearings are wider. They have some more support structures to them than a ball bearing does. You're going to find bearings all through the engine, and the gearboxes, and the pumps, and all that. And that's all going to be part of this lubrication system too. But primarily, the lubrication system is going to be just for the shafts and rotors on the engine itself. See a fire outside, it smells like barbecue.
That's the original.
I don't think so. It smells like something. It smells like food. I can tell between food and turbine fuel. Okay, so
Sure, it's been a while.
I got a little practice. Okay, so when you buy oil, turbine oil, talking about lubrication here, there's a number of different types, but there's also quite a lot of different manufacturers, and this is 3 different manufacturers here. Some of you have seen this stuff or have seen the cans. The military doesn't get them branded quite like this. They get kind of a generic label on them, but British Petroleum or BP makes 2380. It's a really common oil for turbines. It's what we use for this JT8 here. Mobile Jet 254 and Jet 2, 2 pretty darn common oils. Most big operators buy it in bulk. And they also buy it in quarts because it's easy to dispense a quart at a time rather than pumping it out of a tank. So, so it's bought in quarts quite frequently. It's still canned because can is a good, sound way to store this stuff. So it ages. As it ages, it begins to oxidize a little bit. As it oxidizes, it turns a little darker. And so the cans keep it fresh. It does have a shelf life of about 4 years before it should be used. Aeroshell turbine oil. It's popular in some parts of the country, some not. Kind of depends on the local distributor. But I'd say Mobile Jet in the 2380 are probably the 3 most prominent oils that I've ever seen. Now, Standard Oil makes some, Texaco makes some, but this is just kind of a representative of the oil available. Comes in 1 quart, comes in a liter, comes in a gallon, comes in 5-gallon and 55-gallon drums. So this is what the oil looks like. How many of you ever had your fingers in turbine oil? Anybody? Anybody? Not so many of you?
Doesn't feel good.
So Lonnie, is there any synthetic stuff in the aviation?
This is synthetic oil. Yeah, this is synthetic ester oil. Yeah.
Yeah, I just stuck my hand in there.
This stuff, this oil, next time, somebody remind me next time, we'll bring a little cup of oil and I'll let you put your fingers in it, because it has kind of an odd feel to it. It doesn't hurt you, it's not gonna hurt you at all, but it doesn't feel oily, like oil does. It feels kind of
Because
thin.
that photosynthetic stuff.
Pretty thin, it's synthetic in it. And it also is very viscosity stable.
Yeah.
So it doesn't get much thicker when it gets colder, and it doesn't get much thinner when it gets hotter. So that's why we use it in turbines, because of the broad heat ranges that the turbines are exposed to. So when the engine's just sitting around someplace, maybe up in Alaska or Canada, that oil is just about the same thickness as it is when it's at an operating temperature, even in the deserts of Arizona. Okay. So that's why we use this stuff. It's very stable. And that's what it looks like. Maybe next time, I've got some oil out there, I'll break it out for you, once you put your fingers in it. Won't hurt you a bit. You'll be fine. Okay, so we have what is known as a dry sump, and that is because the sump or the oil tank is separate from the engine. Some aircraft, the oil in the sump is really separate. It's mounted up on a bulkhead somewhere. This oil tank happens to be mounted down on the bottom of this engine here. And there's some other features here. So there's an oil filter back here on the gearbox. This is the filler right here. The cap is a lift lever. Give it a quarter turn and pull the cap off. Now I'm going to say this again later on this evening, but I want you to know that when you service one of these things, you have to let the pressure out of the tank. Now ordinarily, the pressure is going to equalize after about 5 to 10 minutes. But don't go running up to one of these things if you have to service it with oil. Pop that cap loose because you might end up with a face full of oil. These tanks get pressurized. It's kind of like a radiator on your car. Any of you ever add coolant to your car? Now, if you ever did, you don't want to cut that cap loose because what's inside that
Pressure.
tank is going to come out and it's going to burn you.
So it's a siphon, right?
So no, let this stuff, let the pressure normalize before you do this. Now, some engines have a valve on them you can tap. Some of them have something you move with a wrench to move it and let the pressure out. But know that this thing has to equalize in pressure. Every maintenance manual is going to tell you how to do it. They don't want you to get hurt. Just know that that's something that can happen to you badly. Right here is an oil, fuel oil cooler. And what they do is they take the heat out of the oil and add heat to the fuel. It makes it flow, makes the fuel flow easier through the nozzles. But the other thing that it does is it takes some heat out of the oil. Up in the front up here, because this is so far removed from the oil system and so far removed from the tank, there is an oil line that runs up from the bottom through this vein and oils this front bearing up here. But the oil has to get back somehow or other. And so the oil builds up in here probably about a third of the way up, and then it's picked up by a little scavenge pump. And that little scavenge pump is nothing more than an oil pump that picks that oil up and pushes it back into the oil system. So there it's de-aerated, we take the air out of it, and then it's added back into the oil system, put back in the oil tank. You'll find that at the back of the engine as well. There's going to be some little, pretty small, but what they do is they give some flow to the oil. Instead of waiting for it to gravitationally drop back to the bottom of the engine and then be pushed back, what they'll do is they'll pick it up in a bearing cavity. So a bearing cavity is a place where the bearing is, where the shaft runs through, and it is sealed, so that you don't end up with a lot of compressor air or turbine air entering it, mixing with the oil. So what's the problem with pumping aerated oil?
It's full, right?
It's foaming,
Yeah.
right? So this is an analogy I used for Anthony when he was in there. So when you go to the beach and you go swimming,
Right.
where do you like to swim the best? In the white water or in the blue water?
Blue.
Blue water, yeah. So that's why, it's because you're not able to be supported in the aerated water. It's not thick, it's foaming, and that's the same thing with oil. We don't want foamy oil being pushed through the system because it doesn't lubricate as well as liquid oil. Okay, so here's some types of oil. You don't have to write down 6081. That's a mineral-based oil. It's 1010 oil is what they call it. That oil is a mineral base. We don't use much mineral-based oil anymore on turbine engines because it just can't take the heat. It's only good up to about 300 degrees. 7808 is still around. That L number is a type 1 turbine oil. That 236.99 is still around. You can still get it. The type 2 oil. It's good up to about 450 degrees. Now remember, this oil is going through some pretty hot places. It might be 1500 degrees where this oil has to pass through. But because the oil is passing through so quickly, it tends to carry the heat out of those zones. So oil does what? Lubricates, and what else?
Cools.
Cools. Exactly right. Third thing it does?
Clean.
Cleans. Yeah, it's going to clean too. So this oil does all of those things just the same way. Okay, so now we're into the modern oils here. This is type 3 oil. Any one of those cans you saw that I showed you there. Type 3. Now most of these mil-spec oils and the type 3 oils are compatible with one another. Most engine manufacturers will tell you though that if you mix these oils, there is a possibility they will begin to foam just from the chemical mixing of the two. So many times they'll say it's okay to use it, but the first chance you get, you have to drain it all out. You add fresh oil to it, you drain it out, you put another load of oil in the engine, and then you can go ahead and run it. So most manufacturers don't like you to mix the oils, even though they are cross-compatible.
By type 3, does it have a higher heat rating than type 2 then?
Yeah, it's 650 degrees, 700 degrees, something like that. I don't remember exactly. So this is a modern turbine oil, synthetic. Now, again, they get thicker and darker with age, and that's just because of oxidation. Do we do oil changes in turbine engines?
No.
Most small engines have a provision for doing that. Most operators don't do oil changes. And the reason is because you pour oil in it, it consumes the oil and you just pour more in. It's kind of a constant oil change going on in these turbine engines. There are some engines that require oil changes, but most do not. And this getting thicker and darker with age usually isn't a problem if the aircraft is used constantly. Okay. So the best lubricant is something that's going to operate at the highest temperatures with the least change in viscosity. So you wouldn't use, like your car, you'd put a 1020 oil in your car if you're going to Alaska, and then in the summertime you might put a 2050 oil in there because it gets warmer. Aircraft engine's not that way. It just uses the one oil everywhere in the world you go. Could be hot as blazes, could be Dubai in the summer, or it could be the North Slope in the winter.
I guess the difference between a turbine and a radial is you don't do oil changes on either, but the radial just leaks it and the turbine eats it.
Yeah, well, they do prescribe oil changes in the radials,
Yeah, I know.
but they're kind of the same. Yeah, you just keep pouring oil through it, is what you're doing. Okay, so synthetic oils don't store as well as mineral oils. Like I said, it's about 4 years. Whoops, get that back. And the stocks of oil should be rotated. So let's say you work for somebody, they bring oil in a pallet, cases of oil, usually 24 cases in 24 cans in a case, 24 quarts, stacked up in boxes. Make sure if you have any connection with it that you take the oldest oil first. Okay? If you're a stock clerk or you're in charge of stores, a lot of mechanics have to deal with the store's issues. What you're going to do is you move the oldest oil forward all the time so that people will take the oldest oil. You're still within the 4-year shelf life of the oil, but you want to keep that stuff moving through. Synthetic oils also can attack paint finishes. Not all, but some. Polyurethanes and urethane finishes, it won't touch it. But you get in enamels, lacquers, acrylic enamels, any of that kind of stuff, acrylic lacquers, any of that stuff, or epoxy even, it'll lift it, turn it into cottage cheese. So be careful with this stuff when you're dripping it and dropping it all over the place. You want to be careful with it.
So it's a good paint remover.
What's that?
It's a good paint remover.
Well, it can be a bad thing because if you take the paint off, usually it ends up dripping it someplace inside. You know, if you're not careful. Maybe you should use a funnel, but you don't. It gets inside, and you take the paint off, and you got a corrosion issue on your hands, especially if you work close to the coast or around a marine environment. Okay, so oil purpose primarily is to prevent bearing damage from friction. And then again, you've got the cooling, you've got the cleaning. We can use it for hydraulic power. You can actually use the oil for hydraulic power to move things. We can use fuel to do that too. Doesn't really matter. We're just going to use it as a hydraulic fluid.
When would you have to use it for hydraulic fluid?
Might use it, so there's a thing called a stator vane actuator on an engine. It needs a source of hydraulic power, and the engine already has oil in it, already has fuel in it, so it may use either fuel or oil as the fluid for the hydraulic.
So the 15 engines are,
What's that?
so the 15 engines are
Yeah, it's already there, there's no point carrying a hydraulic supply.
two different, stages have variable blades.
And it runs off an actuator that's muscled by
Rudy in the city.
also high thermal stability is important. Once again, you don't want it breaking down at high temperatures. The engines, while they run hot, they're pretty stable so far as temperature goes.
Turbo props, what do they use for propeller feathering? For oil. The turbo props, what do they use for propeller feathering?
They use the
For oil.
engine oil, yeah, use the engine oil. So they use, most of those use a common oil supply. There's a few that don't, they have separate oil supplies for the gearbox, but they'll use the same oil supply as the gearbox. Okay, so these bearings here, what do you see? Anybody?
Burn marks,
Burn?
friction marks, or what else?
Scores. For scoring.
Kind of dark.
Scoring, and there's uneven wear.
Yeah, a little bit uneven wear in the scoring. So what would cause the scoring on that bearing?
Debris.
Lack of oil.
Maybe a little lack of oil, maybe what else?
Debris.
Some kind of debris. Yeah, it gets underneath it, it skids across it, and it works its way across. So two of those things have good skid marks on them. This one here is starting to get one, this one here is starting to get one. Excuse me, same place, this one as well. So there's a chip of something got in the oil and it's being rolled across it, and that's why it looks like that. Okay, so this is what oil looks like commonly. You don't know what's bad until you know what's good. This is good right here. This is what you'd be looking for. So this oil is kind of starts to get a dark brown color. You can see that it's a little bit darker in places. Some places it's lighter. What this is carbon beginning to form in the oil. So it's pretty common throughout the life of the engine for it to begin to build carbon. It's just what the engine does. It burns fuel and that carbon gets into the oil. So this is pretty typical here. Just a little dab of moisture here, a little bit of water in the line, but otherwise it's a pretty common sight. This is looking down into a bearing compartment. This bearing compartment here is it runs a little bit hot. You can see now that oil darkens where it's got the most heat. It's right around these areas here. What else do you see in there? Up in the upper right hand corner, what do you see up there?
Sludge.
Sludge? We don't get so much sludge.
Is that carbon
in
buildup?
turbines because of the heat. What else could that be?
Those little pieces of something.
Little pieces of what do we get? What do we generate with a lot of heat and oil?
Cocaine.
Coking. Yeah, it starts to become a little bit of carbon buildup in there. Coking sticks to the surface, literally sticks to the surface and hardens like glass. So this isn't that, but it is little chunks of carbon that are floating around in there. Now this will get picked up eventually with the filter, and it'll be stabilized in the spot. Nothing will happen to it. But places where oil kind of lays and hangs, you see this here. This is the same kind of thing here. If it's not flushed and pushed out of place, it's going to tend to accumulate in cracks and crevices. Also, this is another pretty normal looking surface here, with the exception of little pieces of carbon. Now, if you went in there, you were doing something, doesn't matter so much. You can get in there with a little rag and wipe that up. It wouldn't hurt it one bit. Not one bit. You put it in your rag instead of putting it in a filter. There's the bearing right there. And on that brace. All right, so now this is another bearing cavity. There's two bearings actually that fit into this cavity. One on the front or the back side, one up here, and then one fits in here. But down inside, this is all the scavenge lines. This is where we pick the oil up to pump it back into the engine. This is also, you can see the oil lines come around this way. So here's the spray nozzle for the oil. This is what it just pisses it right onto the bearing. There's nothing trick to it at all. It doesn't run it through a little pool or a puddle. it just pees right onto the bearing. And it's usually, most of these turbine engines operate at about 100, 150 PSI. Now, inside the engine, it builds up some pressure, and that's because of the heat from the engine. It's also, you have all these compressors around these bearings here. You have turbines around the bearings. You have high pressure air moving through the engines. Could be 300, 400 PSI in some of these places. Is that reasonable to think that the air could build up in these bearing cavities as well? That air pressure could build in there.
Yeah.
So we have oil pressure at 100 or 150 PSI. Is the oil even going to go into a cavity where the air pressure is 300 or 400 PSI?
No.
No. So we have to do something to get that air pressure out of those cavities. And so what we have is we have what we call breather lines. Just like a reciprocating engine, we have a breather line that goes into each one of these cavities and lowers that pressure in the cavity for a couple of reasons, but one of them is we want to be able to inject oil into that into those areas for lubrication. Okay, what do you see here? Got a carbon seal here. Carbon seal, this would be like on a gearbox. It would be the seal between the gearbox and a transmission, or between a gearbox and a generator. What do you see? Anything unusual there? So you pulled this thing out, maybe it had a little leak, you pulled it out, now you're looking at it. What would you see there?
Got a little toasty.
Got hot. It's
A little cooking? Who said it got hot? Who said it?
You see the blue?
You see the
Did
blue?
you put it?
Yeah, exactly right. Blue down there. Why would it get blued like that?
Really hot.
Super duper.
Because it got hot?
Super hot.
Something had a lack of lubrication, is what the problem was. So what ended up happening was the carbon still sealed probably, but it got hot and it's going to have warped the carbon out of shape. So it's also beginning to leak a little bit. That's why you're there. So you'll pull this out, stick another one in there, and away you go. Okay. So we have another bearing compartment here. Down inside, you see there's a little pool of oil down in there. And that's all pretty normal. The color here is pretty normal. It's kind of a golden color, and that's just what sticks to the metal in there. So all the metal starts out bright and shiny. But this is pretty normal for what you see in a place like that. See the bearings back here? These bearings are supporting the turbine shaft. This coupling here, these castellations, they attach to the compressor, and that's what drives the compressor at that point there. The two are locked together at that point. So this is the bearing on the turbine, and then this is the well that supports the nozzle that sprays oil on the bearings here. Okay, so we have a couple of systems. We have 3 systems on the engine. I want you to write each one of these down because they will be on the test. So the engine oil system, and I'm going to go over each one of these systems in a little bit of detail as we go through this here. Okay. If you don't get these 3, it's too slow, or your pen's not working, it's no big deal because we're coming back to them. So the first one's a pressure system. The second one is a scavenge system. This is the one that picks the oil up, puts it back in the tank. And then we have the breather system. So this breather system is the one that neutralizes the air pressure. The air pressure inside the engine because of the air pressure that we're building with the compressor. And the combustion section is always going to be a little bit higher than atmospheric, but we try to keep it very close to atmospheric pressure. Okay, so that's it in a nutshell. So these are some of the components that are installed in the system. And these, some of these are installed externally. So you've got the oil tank. The oil pump. The oil pump will be part of the main accessory gearbox, usually. You have an oil filter. Bigger engines, bigger filters. Smaller engines, smaller filters is pretty much the way it works. You're going to have an oil pressure regulating valve somewhere near the oil pump. You have a fuel oil cooler. That's going to cool the oil, warm the fuel Fuel has a tendency to develop ice crystals in it, and you don't want to be pushing that through those nozzles and the fuel control. So what we do is we warm the fuel slightly before we inject it into the system. You might have magnetic chip detectors. We're going to talk about those just all on their own in a week or two. Okay, so the internal parts you might have on the engine would be a de-aerator or an oil separator. That's going to be in the oil tank or the back of the gearbox. You're going to have an oil filter bypass valve. In case the oil filter obstructs, if the oil filter obstructs, we will still want oil to go through it. We won't have filtered oil, but we'll still have oil go through that part of the system. You'll have scavenge pumps. You might have 2 or 3 scattered throughout the engine to return oil to the oil tank. And then in the oil flow path, you're probably going to have a little strainer, and it's going to be called a last chance filter. So what the last chance filter is going to do is going to be picking up little debris, little bits of carbon, maybe a piece of a seal that got clipped or cut. It could be a little bit of dirt in the fuel. It could be anything, but you don't need that in your oil nozzle. So if you have it in the oil nozzle, it can restrict the flow through the nozzle. And when you restrict the flow through the nozzle, what happens to the bearing? Yeah, so you're going to cook the bearing. That's what's going to happen. Now, in some places, some of you remember when we looked at the turbine out there, I had you pull the oil nozzles out. You can see some of those are really teeny-weeny little holes that spray oil down onto the bearings. And a little bit of coking in that area can obstruct that hole real easily. And if it obstructs that hole, the bearing is going to die. It'll take a dump. Next thing you know, it'll come apart. Next thing you know, you got the turbine flailing around back there. And then you've got an engine destroyed. So it's pretty important that you take care of that stuff without allowing it to coke. Okay, so the oil pressure subsystem. This is the flow. It goes from the oil tank, usually via gravity, into the main oil pump. So if you drop a rag in the oil tank, where's it going to go next? Through the oil pump.
Hopefully you grab it.
Now, I'll talk to you about this when I do filters, but there was a labor action at a small airline that used to be here in San Diego, and some dumbass decided he was going to throw a rag in the oil tank, right? So he threw a couple of rags in the oil tank, and it ground them up, it obstructed the filters, and it clogged up the oil pumps. So, needless to say, that engine wasn't a very happy camper. They ended up doing an in-flight shutdown with the engine. It still couldn't pass the oil because rags, being what they are, they still obstruct stuff. So it got up into the valves that open when the filter obstructs, and they ended up having to shut the engine down, lost all the oil pressure. So if you see something like that or hear about it, say something, because somebody can get hurt. Could be you, could be your wife, your family, anybody on that airplane. People just do stupid stuff, you know? And that guy, I think the union stuck up for him, believe it or not. And so the guy got to keep his job. They found out who it was.
How could a guy like that?
That's what unions are for anymore, don't you know?
Yeah, but that was intentional.
Yeah, sure it was. Yeah.
How do you keep your job
I
after
mean,
doing
one thing
something
if
like
it's-
that?
Yeah. And none of that matters because what he did could have killed somebody real easy. All right, so from the oil pump. Oil pump's going to increase the pressure and deliver oil to the bearings and the accessory drives. Now, the oil pump really doesn't deliver pressure. What does it deliver? Flow. And how do we get pressure out of the oil pump? Resistance to that flow, right? So we have calibrated leakage in the system. Goes out to the nozzles. You only have nozzles so big. And once it hits that nozzle, no more oil can flow through it. So that's where it starts building up pressure. It's back pressure is what we're talking about. Okay. Now the oil sends the oil pump sends pressurized oil out to the oil filter. Also, at the same time, so it kind of splits its course. It goes out to the oil filter also. This pump is moving a lot of oil. I'm going to show you this pump here in just a second. I got it sitting right in front of me here. Why wouldn't we put the oil filter first to protect the pump? So you have the oil tank, then you have the oil pump, then you have the oil filter. Why wouldn't I put the oil filter between the tank and the pump?
Think
Because
it's
it's slow
clogged
down
up.
the flow,
Sheds
right?
teeth, it goes right to the engine.
No, because you cause cavitation in the pump.
Yeah, slow down the flow.
The pump will tend to cavitate. It won't suck oil very fast, but it'll sure pump oil pretty fast. So that's why they do that. So they take the oil right out of the tank, put it in the pump, and then push it through the filter. You'd have to have a gigantic pump to move enough oil to draw it through a filter. The filter's going to restrict the flow. There's no two ways about it. But when you have pressure, you can force it through the filter. All right, so I have an oil pump here. Let me see what the next slide is. While we're talking about oil, so here's an oil pump, and I'll pass it around. Don't pull the shaft out; it'll come out, but don't pull it out. So we have what we call a duplex oil pump here. Duplex oil pump. One side's bigger, one side's smaller. You can see that. I want you to all look at this, and we'll come back to this one. The last person who does, you'll probably be the last person here, Ed, because I'm going to go this way with it. And when we get it back, I'm going to ask you which side is the scavenge side, and which side is the pressure side of that pump. So one side is pressure, one side is scavenge. One picks up the oil, the other one sends it down the road. And they're two separate systems. They're not interconnected within that body. Okay, so the oil filter, getting onto the oil filter, it's going to trap and suspend any chunks, any particulates. Could be carbon, could be metal, could be bits of O-ring, any of that stuff. They typically be one of two different types of filters. The bypass valve may be within the filter itself, or the bypass valve may be in the housing that the filter is suspended in. But typically there is a bypass valve somewhere in the filter assembly. And the reason, once again, if the filter obstructs for any reason, oil can still flow through the system. Now they have switches, pressure switches on these things, and what they're doing is they're measuring the pressure across the line from the filter into the system, and if the filter pressure gets to be too high, the light illuminates. That means that the filter has been clogged. And why would a crew care about that? Well, if you're not too far away from a landing point, you're probably going to keep the engine running and fly it all the way to the ground. But if you're a long way out, you may want to shut the engine down. So there are parameters and reasons why you might want to shut an engine down. Typically, they don't like to shut down engines. All right. Anymore, it used to be a light that came up, but now it'll be a message that pops up on the EVIS, the engine flight display, and so that will show up as a clogged filter alert.
Could you just go back one slide for 1 second?
Sure.
Okay, thank you.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So hot oil is cooled in the fuel oil cooler. I talked about that. That's a place where we're going to use the cool fuel to
Offload and heat up the fuel.
take some of the heat out of the oil, but we're also going to warm up the fuel from the hot oil. So it's going to be a change in temperature between the two. All right, so if it gets obstructed, there's going to be a bypass valve open on it, and we'll go right around the cooler. You're only going to have just a little bit of oil go through the cooler, and that will help to keep the temperature down, but usually it doesn't keep it down far enough. Okay, then oil flows through the last chance strainers into the spray nozzle. Spray nozzle just spray the oil directly onto the bearing. So we're gonna be spraying pressurized, cool, clean oil right directly onto the bearing. Now, cool oil is relative. Cool oil will be about 200 degrees. So that's gonna carry some of the heat out of the bearing, it's gonna lubricate the bearing, and it's also gonna pick up any debris, put it back into the system, run it through the filters and pick up that material and put it back, take it out of harm's way. Now the other subsystem here, we got the scavenge system. This is gonna collect the oil throughout the engine from the bearing compartments. It's gonna drain into lines. The little scavenge pump's gonna pick it up and return it to the oil tank. This is called scavenge. It's like a bird that's scavenging for whatever's left. And that's what you're looking for. You're looking for whatever's left of the oil laying around in the engine.
The scavenge pumps that are mounted further away from the main pump, how are they driven?
They're driven mechanically.
Okay.
So off of the end of the shaft. So let's say the compressor, way at the very front of the compressor.
Mhm.
There'll be a little stub that stick off the end of the
Okay.
compressor with a gear about this big around, and that little gear will then turn the pump itself. Okay, so it's gonna be a gear type scavenge pump. You're gonna send it back to the main scavenge pump. Could be internal and external plumbing. Some engines like Rolls-Royce don't have much internal plumbing. They have all the plumbing external. You start dealing with Pratt Whitneys and General Electrics, IAEs, CFM and such, they'll have a mixture of internal and external plumbing. Now, with respect to that pump that we have floating around the office here, they can be duplex pumps with a scavenge and a primary pump integrated together off the same drive. They're two separate systems, but they're integrated together on the same drive. So the scavenge oil is in, pumped, pushed back to the oil tank through the plumbing. When it goes back into the tank, it goes through something called a deaerator. And this is where we take the air out of the oil. Most of the time it is a centrifugal de-oiler. So we push that scavenge oil and vapor back through this de-oiler. It centrifugally spins it. The air is spun out and the liquid is retained, drops back into the tank. So this is still a bunch of hot oil floating around in this engine. We also have high pressure in the system, and this is called a hot tank oil system on this.
As opposed to cooling it before it goes in the tank.
As opposed to cooling it before it goes back into the tank. Okay, the last part of this system, the third part, make sure you remember what these three parts are by name. This is gonna prevent excessive air pressure within the engine. So if we have too much air pressure inside the engine, none of this de-oiler, none of the oil pressure, none of the flow of this oil is gonna work. You have to get the air out of the oil. So that when it comes back to the tank, we're pumping nothing out of the tank but liquid oil. Now, some of you who worked on the air seals know that there's a controlled amount of air leakage past those seals. There is a small flow of air that can mix into the bearing compartments. And this is where we're gonna pick that oily air up. This air is called breathe air. Breathe air comes from the air from the compressors, the turbines, the combustion chambers. We're gonna pick that air up, we're gonna send it back into the scavenge system. The breathe air also goes overboard. Now, it used to be, I was explaining to Anthony in here that I've been over to Miramar and there's these big black spots underneath all the airplanes over there. The civilian world, they wouldn't put up with that. The EPA would be in there like fleas on a dog. They'd make you clean that mess up. Most of these airplanes now have what they call environmental catch tanks, so that if you lose air or oil overboard, it has to be completely separated. You put a drop of oil in the ground, you better have kitty litter on in a heartbeat, because they won't put up with dirty grams. The reason for that is many of these sewer systems or drain systems for stormwater run into other storm catch places like rivers, lakes, bays, and that sort of thing. Most airports now have a sump that all this material goes into, and they separate it, clean that water before it goes back into the bays and beaches and such. But here, a number of years ago, there was a company down at Harbor Drive called Ryan. And they had a plating shop down there. The plating shop, they controlled the liquids in their tanks pretty well, but they always had some slosh over. And that slosh over would go down through the drains in the floor into the storm drains. And then it would go in the storm drain down into the bay. And so you can imagine dumping nickel and lead, cadmium, and all kinds of other crazy things, potassium, everything else into the bay. What they did to the fish and the wildlife in the bay. It also made the water turn kind of green certain times of the year. So they made them clean that up. It was expensive, but it's really worked out for the best. In most places you go to, if you spill some oil, you better get it cleaned up pretty gosh darn quick, because it's part of their environmental regulations. Anybody who has space on a ramp is going to have to abide by that. Okay, so this breathe air is going to exit the bearing compartments. It's going to be large external or internal tubing. It's going to be something that's going to be about an inch in diameter, so that the air can flow through it very easily. The engine expels this air. This air is called breather air. It's like you breathe, just in and out, just like that. Breather air. And again, that's going to go typically into an environmental catch tank, just a can if nothing else, so the oil can settle out of it and then the air can go overboard. The oil will then be dumped back into the oil tank. It's one last chance to catch it. Okay, breather is returned to the main accessory gearbox from both the engine and the oil tank. Advance all three together, the engine, oil tank, and the gearbox, all three are vented together to hold it at just above atmospheric pressure, and then it goes overboard. The air oil mist, as part of that breather, goes through the de-oiler, also goes through that de-oiler. It separates the air from the oil. So we're going to be centrifugally separating the air, the oil out of the air before we dump it overboard.
So when you say dump over, there's a valve that you just chuck it over?
Through a vent, a lot of times, but most of the time it goes into an environmental container, and then the environmental container vents it overboard. So it gets one last chance to catch the oil before it goes overboard. So a lot of times you see a vapor coming out on maybe a humid day, most of that is water vapor. But sometimes it's gonna be kind of blue, and that's gonna be oil vapor. Okay, so the oil with the air removed is just gonna go back into the gearbox. We'll return back to the tank. Most often the oil tank is attached directly to the gearbox. Sends it back into the tank. And that air is just sent overboard ultimately. So we have three basic systems. What's the first one?
Pressure?
Pressure. Second one?
Scavenge.
Scavenge. Third one? Breather. Okay, remember those three. You'll see that question again. So turbine engine uses, as I pointed out earlier, uses a dry sump lubrication. The oil is held in a reservoir or the oil tank until it's needed. Sometimes the oil tank is remoted from the engine. Most of the time it is attached to the side of the engine. It is not part of the engine per se, but is attached to the side of the engine and the main accessory gearbox. So you have the pumps that supply the oil through the engine, push it through the lines to the oil nozzles. We're almost done. Stay with me here. Almost done. The sumps and the scavenge pumps, so all those bearing cavities have a sump in them. They're going to be picked up by the scavenge pumps. The oil is going to be sent back. And then we have the oil coolers. We're going to cool the oil. And we use turbine oil for a number of things. So we can use it in the starters to lubricate the starter. They're not part of the engine oil system, but we use engine oil in the starter. We also use engine oil in generators, in the generator drives for lubrication. We can use it to lubricate drives for hydraulic pumps and fuel pumps, fuel flow regulators, all that sort of thing. So we use oil for a lot of different things. You can also use oil or use fuel in a lot of these different places as well. Okay. John Hickman put that one in there. So here's another oil cooler here. It's in the fan air path. What would happen if they hit a bird?
Clogging.
What could happen if they hit a bird?
They take out the cooler and then you start having oil spray and.
Then you're gonna have oil all over the place, yeah. Now, this is in the cold stream, so you probably wouldn't be looking for a fire, but certainly, you're gonna lose oil pressure if nothing else, because the pump won't keep up with a broken oil cooler like that. So this has kind of gone away from the way of doing things, not so much anymore. What you're gonna find is most of these now will have a duct, and that duct will be something like this scoop right up here that you see. Only they'll have another duct specifically built for this cooler, and the cooler will be attached to the core of the engine. So that is just picking up fan air and blowing it through the cooler, rather than having the cooler hanging out here, risking life and limb, should you ingest something. Okay, so maintenance on this stuff. There really isn't much to do. There's gonna be maybe oil analysis. That usually comes with a filter change. You pull the filter out, you stick it in a bag, it goes to some engineering department, they check it. So what they're doing is what they call trend analysis. They're looking for particles of metal on an atomic level to see what's happening with that engine. They can tell what the health of the engine is pretty easily. It's not really meant to pick up chunks and pieces. You may have, so you have plenty of filter changes. As maintenance people, you're gonna have tons of filter changes. You get so darn good at it, you won't know what happened. Oil changes, not so much, but some engines require oil changes. So if you work in a base somewhere, you could end up changing filters every day, every shift. Might be one of the first things you do, part of your job. Goes pretty quick. It's usually just 4 nuts. Take it off, pull the filter housing off, stick a new filter in, put one in a bag, new O-ring on it, slam it back together. It's about all there is to it. Nothing too tricky. Takes you maybe 15 minutes to change a filter most of the time. Don't get it on the ground. Okay. Again, a lot of these systems are pressurized or get pressurized through use, so make sure that you, when you do change a filter, it's just like opening the cap to the oil tank. If you pull that filter cap off, it's going to be pressurized too. So make sure you allow the system to become depressurized before you start working on it. And also, starter cavities and generator cavities should be depressurized. They'll hold pressure for a very long. They'll hold pressure for a week. So make sure there's usually a button that you push to depressurize the cavity. Make sure that you do that, because if you pull the fill plug off of it, you're going to end up with a face full of oil.
Could you go back one slide, please?
Sure.
Okay, thank you.
I think that's it. That'd be it. Oh, the last one here. Just be sure you have the correct procedures. Every aircraft has its own procedures, has its own methods of doing things, and make sure you follow it in the maintenance manual, the AML, Aircraft Maintenance Manual. So this pump here, turn that back to Mr. Pinzon. So, Mr. Pinzon, which side of that? We're gonna leave if you get this answer right.
Past this one.
Okay. You're on the hook, babe. You're on the hook, babe. So,
Use a lifeline.
so which side is the pressure side, which side is the scavenge side, and why? Two-part question. Nobody's hoping you get this.
I hope you get it.
No pressure.
Because we're all packing up.
You guys scream out the answers.
No, I don't wanna hear, I wanna hear out of you.
Ask the audience. 50-50.
One side's pressure and one side is scavenge. So, anybody else, pressure side does what?
Would it be the bottom?
Provides flow.
No, pressure side does the flow, and what does the scavenge side do?
Sucks it up.
Picks it up and returns it. Alright, so, I'm getting my stool out of the way here. Which side is the pressure and which side is the scavenge?
Wouldn't the scavenging be the bigger?
I can tell you they're rooting for you, they're hoping you get this. So I'll start on ignition if you don't get this.
Oh, oh, dude.
Sure, and low. I feel like you say this in the first one, say the bottom part is for the, scavenge.
We'll have to start my computer back.
Quick, say something else.
I'm at a loss for words right now.
Well, so think about this, remember I was talking about going to the beach, you've been at the beach, right?
I hate the beach here.
Okay, so Mr. Myrick, you've been at the beach, you swam in the water, you swim in the foamy water, you swam in the blue water or the green water. Which one do you swim in best?
Blue water.
The blue water, okay, because it's all liquid, right? And so you get a real good grip while you're stroking out there, and so, if you got a lot of, air in the water, it doesn't move as easily. You
Need
don't
more
move
arms.
as easily, right? So you really have to swim like a son of a gun. So rethink your answer there. If you had a lot of air in the oil, which side would be the most effective?
To have the air, then be going to the top, and once
Right.
the air is out, then be going out to the top.
Exactly right, yeah, so we answered our own question. Everybody okay with that?
Good to go.
But they do it the calf roping, right? The guy gets the calf healed, the guy goes like this and they stop the clock, get out of here, you guys.
You understand why I'm more people? Well, the way I'm not doing it is there's more volume going to the bigger chamber. That means there has to be something else, there has to be something broken.
Yeah, let's see it again. Are you here tomorrow? Just next week, we'll check it out. Yeah, take a minute. I checked yours.
Good night, Lonnie.
Good night. See you guys next week, or I'll see you tomorrow or something.
Yeah, next week.
Okay, good.
For how much time are you gonna be exposed there?
Once again, it still doesn't change the temperature outside though.
Kind of look at the bright side.
There is no bright side.
Tomorrow, 30 enough. Freezes on the road. I won't. Because I don't want to be crazy on the road. What are you talking about? See what Christmas tree comes out? That's what I'm talking about.
Comes out now.
Hey, Chris.
Comes out now.
Good night. See you. Have a good weekend.
So I'm gonna see it to the best of my abilities.
Yeah.
Hey, Lon,
Hey.
you think for
You want a bathroom?
the non-violent classes, do you think it's still require the class for the human factors and the ignition?
No, not for that at all.
Not for
No,
that? Oh.
no, you
It's
just
just
jump
one class?
right in there.
Mm,
We had people just come off the street, to take that class, and it's the only class. We had two classes. Because both classes had just a few people had to be learning together. Oh, yeah, check it out, check the catalog, it's probably online.
Oh, yeah, it's already online. Alright, thanks, Lonnie. See you later.
yeah, see ya.
He was really ready to go home right at the end there. Fuck, man.
Yeah,
Flip to the slides last night, take a picture.
exactly. I'm still writing the last notes for him.
I've got 3 slides to fix, to finish writing down tomorrow.
Yeah.
I figured it'll take me out before I can get it shut down.
I'm on my last slide here. It's even summing it up is just like a bitch.
Right?
I want Lonnie to take his own classes and see how fast he can write.
I want Lonnie to do his own written. See how much sense they make.
Let's say last slide, good. Ah, thank God. Direction. Crikey, dude.